So, talking about Brazil in the Americas, that was the main topic of one of the panel this morning. It's very important that we first of all look this BRICS initiative, meaning Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, not as a play with the words here, not as a brick in sense of block, but more like a bricolage. It's a concept from anthropology or cultural science that it's a kind of handcraft done mixing different materials that gives a new shape, some object or a new form, something unique. Of course, a bricolage also it's by improvisation. That's not. I mean, when we're talking about BRICS and all the governmental states agreements and trade agreements. But in a sense that these 5 countries, they are really, really different from each other in all senses, economically speaking, culturally speaking, and even actually today their different internal, national, political ways of managing the state, public policies, and so on. So it's done, I would say, when we're talking about the BRICS countries, we're talking about a effort bringing together 5 regional powers. That's very important. So less concerned with a global, multipolar world, but more related to 5 important countries in their regions. Of course, especially if we talk about China, we can talk about China in Africa, China in Latin America, but primarily our concern or let's say research for agenda research is to look at those countries, how they are influential and being influenced regionally. Then comes to my third point, is that it's impossible or it's not wise to look only those 5 countries isolated or 5 together. It's very important to look them in relation to what we call in the political economy the middle income countries. Like for example, in South America, it's impossible just to talk about Brazil influencing the neighbor countries in the region. Even being a regional power, Brazil is also has very strong ties with Argentina, a middle-income country, with Venezuela, with Chile, and others. And those middle-income countries is also influenced and being influenced by these BRIC countries. So basically what we're saying is that when we're talking about this BRICS initiative, it's very important not to look them as a block, only 5 of them, but how they related to their regional neighbors. Secondly, it's very important to see that there is a lot of concrete efforts and agreements and trade agreements, but it's always a combination of cooperation and competition, meaning it's investments and trade. Sometimes it's not just related to one country, but several countries. Well, from there, my third point is that when we're talking about BRICS, their most important initiatives are their decision last year, 2014, about creating 2 main financial institutions. One is the BRIC Development Bank, and another one they're calling a reserve currency or an international financial reserve fund. Both are already decided and agreed between the 5 countries, and they basically are trying to develop, create, and organize different financial institutions to probably, in a geopolitical perspective, balance the North Atlantic hegemony in terms of financial and economic assets around the world. Also talking about BRICS in Latin America, another point is very important is when we think about not just Brazil and Argentina, and I have mentioned, but also how China is investing or giving financial support some countries. China has invested lately after 2011, 2012. China is investing more in Latin America, in Caribbean countries than the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank combined. So it's a huge investor in the continent. But most of those investments goes to 4 or 5 countries, even if there is some flows coming into other countries, but mainly is going to Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, and Ecuador. And it's a very important aspect of those investments. They are based on loans and less on foreign direct investments. There is some Chinese companies, private companies or state companies doing some direct investments, but mostly those investments are run or done by loans. And some of them call loans for oil or investment for oil means that Chinese is invest in terms of getting the payment back through commodities, oil or agricultural commodities, grains and meat and others. In terms of Brazilian influence in Latin America, like I said before, it's a combination of influencing but also being influenced, and it's a combination by cooperation and competition. Brazilian mainly has 2 ways of influencing, investing in Latin America, and then we should restrict not Latin America as a whole, but basically South America and even the South Cone, meaning the Mercosur trade agreements, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Paraguay, and recently Venezuela, and so. So Brazil is not also like I mentioned related to China, is not investing and being so influential in the whole region. In terms of what kind of investments and influence Brazil is having, is mainly after 2000, the Latin American countries and Latin American Caribbean countries, they had this initiative for the integration of regional infrastructure in South America, what's called IRSA. And basically, like the name says, is agreement between the governments and countries to invest in building or renewing or improving infrastructure, roads, energy production, pipelines for gas, natural gas, for oil, and so on. And this basically is the most important initiative. It is not done only by Brazil, but it's a regional agreement. And most of Brazilian public resources through this Brazilian National Development Bank is done under that agreement. So means there's a lot of investments on infrastructure. And those kind of investments, they will directly or indirectly affect our what we're calling here in this conference agrarian change. Meaning, we're not talking only about agriculture in terms of who is producing what kind of agricultural commodity, but is related to land and how land is being used and how this use is interacting with agriculture, as one economic activity, but also mining, but also energy production, like I mentioned. Like, for example, there is a lot of investments on biofuels or agrofuels or energy. And those kind of investments, of course, affects the way the land being used, and that means a change in the agrarian perspective, or it's affecting local and rural communities. And of course, our research is new. We have more, I would say, research questions and research issues than a precise conclusion. But clearly, there is no much Brazilian investment on land in terms of buying land. Of course, we have two very important and I would say painful situations. Is that in 1960s, 1970s, Brazilian large farmers went to Paraguay, and 1980s, 1990s into Bolivia, and bought land, huge tracts of land to cultivate soya. And most of those have been exported to European countries or now to China. And that's a sort of, we calling land grab. But recently, like for example, in the period of BRICS initiative, there's not much investments directly on land, but all these investments in infrastructure and production of commodities, mining or agriculture, is directly or indirectly affecting how the local population, small-scale farmers and producers are using or not the land. And that's our, let's say, main research question. How all these agreements, BRICS agreements, but also these regional agreements are affecting or not in resulting in agrarian transformations. That basically our main question, and of course, related to that, how the local population, communities, small-scale farmers, indigenous communities, traditional communities are being affected by those new investments in infrastructure or mining, or oil drilling, or even production of agricultural commodities.